He had always been afraid of the dark. It was the first thing Ryan could remember, fiercer than his mother's love, stronger than the glimmer of sun, then aching with a deep eternal loneliness that clung to him in an embrace that whispered of unnameable, unseen things, which lurked and loitered, always watching, always waiting, always by his side or behind him, but never there when he turned around, never there where he could see. He remembered his mother telling him he never slept through the night when he was a baby, not like his older brother Sean. The dark did not love Sean in the same way. It left Sean alone at night so that he cuddled and settled and slumbered peacefully. It was the reason Ryan knew that his brother's stories of monsters and villains were a deliberate attempt to frighten him, for the dark had clearly not shared its secrets with Sean. For instance, Sean did not know of the hanged criminal that swung outside their bedroom window, had hung there so long, dangling from the eaves, that his mad gibbering had ceased many centuries ago, and now his bones rattled and shook in their own crazy whimpering every time the wind blew. His mother had told him that the strange noises were only the creaks that every old house loves to make, but Ryan knew better. The dark had whispered the truth to him. On the very fierce nights the bones would dance and jig against the window, as if they were trying to get in, and they probably were. For the dark had told him that once every 100 years, under a special type of full moon, the murdered murderer had the chance to steal a new body, a fresh little boy, preferably, so that it could begin again and start its life of crime anew. Ryan knew that he was that little boy, and on windy nights, when the full moon leered mockingly at him through the window, he would hear the creaking crack of old bones knocking against the glass. Trip, trap, trip, trap, whispering for him, calling to be let in. It didn't matter how far he crawled under the blankets, or how tightly he jammed his ears against the constant murmuring that sounded just like the rustling of the trees. He knew that one night it would come, on one very special night, and he could only pray again and again that it wasn't this night, wasn't real, wasn't him. But the dark had told him it was. It was proud of itself, the dark. Strong and scary and relentless. The dark was like gnashing teeth in a long black throat. It was dark like pincers, dark like needles and claws, dark like imagination and a memory that never forgets. Sean also didn't know about the mad doctor, the one who lived inside the wall and liked nothing better than to experiment on the young, preferably small boys if he could get them. Sometimes in the early hours, when the moon was new or smothered in clouds, and the night was dark, like the end of all things, Ryan would see the wall by his bed start to shimmer, rustling in the blackness, as though alive with the squirming crawl of snakes, or ants, or spiders. But it wasn't any of those things. Instead, the wall would glimmer and spark, gradually move forward as though preparing to crush him, and then he would see the crack of the doorway inch open, just a sliver, and beyond it the roar of the fierce, slightly greenish flames of the fire, raging and stoking, and ready to consume whatever the doctor deemed useless at that moment for his experiment. Sometimes Ryan had even seen something tossed in, part of a limb or a bloody tooth, and once something small and hairy and still yelping. He wanted to bury himself deep beneath the blankets on those nights so that he wouldn't be seen, but somehow he could never prevent himself from looking, as if something were standing behind him, forcing his eyelids wide open. dry and staring and terrified as the crack of the doorway swung open a little further, and he could see the doctor waiting, eyes only visible between the screen of the surgical mask. Eyes so black and bottomless, it was as if the dark lived within him, licking its lips expectantly at Ryan as the doctor's gloved fingers pressed repeatedly on the sharp surgical pincers they held. Click, clack, click, clack, like the crunch of things newly dead and ready for the fire. One day Ryan knew the door would open even further, wide enough then for the gloved arm to stretch out and touch him, close enough then for the vice-like fingers to clamp down on him and drag him beyond to the terrors that waited within. He knew that one night it would come, on one very special night, and he could only pray again and again that it wasn't this night, wasn't real, wasn't him. But if the swinging bones of the hanged man and the ghoulish grin of the mad masked doctor weren't bad enough, Ryan knew that Sean also wasn't aware of the worst one of all. The cellar. It was the most scary and the most secret of all the dark special places, for the cellar was where the moon monster waited. It liked little boys, the moon monster. It had lost itself there in the cellar, the dark had told him, many eons ago, when it had slid down a moonbeam, just a tiny scrap of a creature living alone in the dust and the dark. But it had grown, and so had its appetite and inclinations, for now it liked nothing more than little boys. The crunch and spit and tear of them, the grab and gobble and swallow of them. It was greedy for them, the dark had told him, greedy to crack them in two, to suck on their bones, lap at their blood, until the fresh, bright juice of them ran down its great, long throat, and dirty matted fur to smell and fester in the shelter of the dark, until the next little boy came along. Of all the places in the house, Ryan feared the cellar the most, and the worst part of it all was that he couldn't avoid it. There it sat, smack dab below the core of the house, with the monster lurking and panting beneath its feet, sniffing and slavering expectantly at the flow of his breath and his blood and his fresh boy smell as he hurried to and fro, scuttling past it, quick as he could, on his way to somewhere else. He dreaded his mother asking him to fetch her something from the cellar, for he knew that when he did, the bloody clawed hand would stretch out, long and taloned, and reeking with the memory of the others who had gone before. He knew it would seize him, sucking him into its open mouth like the pull of a vacuum, and bringing its teeth down sharp and unceremonious, until crick, crack, crick, crack, he was gone. That was what the dark had told him, night after night, as it whispered lovingly in his ear, hungry for his fear, feeding it, caressing it, pressing its need against his face like an unwanted lover as he lay with eyes wide open, smothering his breath within its endless staring blackness, as though gobbling him up. Oh, how Ryan hated the dark, his fear encasing him like a wetsuit, his breathing sharp and shallow, as though each one was his last. He hated the dark, and its sticky, sweaty love for him. He would hate it forever. And if there was one thing he knew that for certain. But forever is a long time, and the dark is much longer than that. For it was there in the beginning, before all things, just as it will still be there long after the end. The dark knows all the tricks there are to know, and all the stories too. And it smiled to itself at Ryan's determination and its great age and wisdom, for it knew, too, what was to come. And after all, it was the robbers that did it. Real robbers, too, not like the ones in the dark stories. On that night, that special night that he'd been dreading and awaiting so long, Ryan was sure he was the only one awake. He could hear Sean snoring triumphantly in the next bed, and there was no sound coming from anywhere else in the house, except that. Ryan raised himself slightly, listening intently, imagining his ears pricked forwards like that of a dog. There was a sound, a soft and muffled jiggle, again and then again, and then a quick, sharp snap, like something being cut. Ryan's mind ran through the noises of the house like a film on fast forward. It was nothing he knew from the daytime, and nothing, thank God, that he knew from the dark. Then what? Cautiously he slipped out of bed, hovering silently on the landing above the stairs. All was dark, for the moon was hidden beneath a thick black cloud, and something told him that it would not be right to flick on the light switch yet. He had no trouble finding his way, for he knew the dark would tell him where to go. He could feel its presence now, heavy by his ear, quivering as if anticipant, wetting its lips excitedly, as the three figures came into view downstairs, framed in the glimmering of the small torch suddenly haloed in the velvet below. One holding it, and another just behind it, and the third shape outlined in the shadows beyond that. There were three of them, and they had broken into his house. For Ryan, the moment seemed both instantaneous and eternal. Amidst all the fears that had haunted him over the years, he had never entertained this one, for the dark had never told him of it. But it was telling him now. He could see it scuttle into the shadow behind him as the torch wavered and flickered, settling on him at last like a dim, tiny spotlight. He could see it clambering upside down on one of the beams barring the ceiling, its face unnervingly twisted the wrong way round to leer at the intruders. Its long, spidery fingers and tendrils of hair spinning further shadows into the darkness like a web entrapping all within it, grinning at Ryan as the third man, the one from the shadows, sprang silently up the stairs and seized him. The rough gloved hand smothering his mouth so tightly with its sticky pressure that he could scarcely breathe.
Now, sonny,
an equally sticky voice whispered into his ear.
You help us and stay quiet, and you'll be all right. We want to know where all the goodies are. TV, computers, jewellery, any money or artworks. You tell me now and be quick about it. Otherwise you know what will happen.
Yeah.
Another voice crept towards him suddenly out the darkness, as the other two robbers surrounded him.
We'll grind you up and feed you to our dog.
Ryan was silent. He was looking at the dark, its head flipped back the right way now. It was still grinning at him, and Ryan knew suddenly not to believe them, for the dark had not told him it was so. But he remembered what the dark had told him, and he smiled. The robbers didn't notice. They were too busy eyeing the terrain for spoils, too busy enjoying their own power and trying to intimidate him. Only Ryan could see the dark, its tendril fingers waving like octopus suckers as they pointed, and Ryan led the way. As they followed, a hand wrapped menacingly around Ryan's throat in case he attempted to run or scream. He told them softly of his brother's coin collection, the one that their grandfather had left him. Their mother had it valued, and it made a tidy little nest egg indeed. Sean was very proud of it, checked the coins weekly, polishing them and storing them again in a special velvet pouch, which he kept hidden beneath the jumble of junk in his sock drawer. There was no fear of Sean awakening, he told them, for his brother slept like the dead. He hoped the robbers didn't also know that the dead didn't always sleep. Sean had flipped over onto his stomach when they entered the room. He was still snoring loudly, his mouth wide open, and a lock of fair hair celebrating a repeated narrow escape from being sucked wetly into his mouth. There was little chance of him waking unless the robbers were very careless indeed. Ryan eyed them carefully as he pointed towards the drawer. It was positioned directly beneath the window, which was always left open a crack at night to let the fresh air in. They were surprisingly young, all three of them, much younger than Ryan had originally thought. Two of them looked like they could still be in school, and the other not much older than that. Ryan hoped fervently it was young enough. They certainly seemed very experienced robbers, despite their lack of age. The one with the hand around his throat, slinking it up carefully to muffle his mouth and pinning his arms back behind him with the other, as a preventative measure. One then moved quietly towards the drawer, as the third stood back and watched. It was still dark in the room, although Ryan knew that the moon was out there somewhere. He bit his lip in a kind of prayer. If only the clouds would part now, so that the shadows could come through. He could scarcely breathe as the robber jostled in the drawer, cursing under his breath as he rattled the odds and ends collection of junk as Sean had collected and kept the whole of his 12 years. He had hidden the coins well. Ryan couldn't see the robber's face, but he felt sure the expression was growing very ugly. Then suddenly, a gap in the clouds and the flicker of moonlight, and Ryan could see the robber's face triumphant as he held the tiny velvet pouch aloft, aglow in the moonlight, the very special moonlight of a hunter's moon. For just a second before the heavy bank of clouds drowned the light and shadows once more, Ryan's heart sank, but the dark smiled. Outside, the wind began to rise and the dark winked at Ryan, its cheeks bloated and disproportionately fat, like a black swelling pufferfish. It was blowing the clouds away, and Ryan could suddenly hear the rattling clack of the bones and chain, crawling, creeping, seeking outside his bedroom window. The robbers heard them too, and all three looked up sharply in a sudden flood of fear. They were old, the bones of that hanged man, and clumsy with all their centuries of swaying in the breeze, loose and battered like a gruesome baby's mobile. Yet they moved surprisingly quickly. Perhaps it was the lure of fresh blood, a new body, a new life. Trip, trap, slip, slap. The clatter outside became a slither, and the slither outside became a slurp. Suddenly the bones slid forward, as if drawn on a string, over and through the crack of the sill, over and through the flapping curtains, over and through the young robber who had taken Sean's coins, until it seemed that his very skin had been torn from him, and only his skeleton stood before them, grinning. It nodded quickly once to Ryan, made a rude noise in the cavity of its throat bones, like the shell of a swear word, and slung the now swinging sack of loose skin and clothes that had once been the robber over its shoulder. Then it was gone, out through the window and over the night sky, and Ryan knew he would not see it again. Now, if only, he prayed, and once again the dark smiled. The robbers were aghast, almost forgetting themselves in the shock of losing their friend, the one that held Ryan, shaking him till his teeth rattled as he asked again and again what had been done with him. The robber's voice had risen to a high-pitched squeak, and his partner attempted to silence him anxiously. But they needn't have worried. Would have taken more than a night terror to dislodge Sean's comfortable dreams. And he slept on, his tongue half hanging out now like a family dog. Ryan wondered if he would start shaking his leg, But there was no time for that now. The dark had blown itself out. The cloud bank again settled in, swamping the moon once more beneath its thick midnight mesh. Ryan was so happy to see that the robbers had forgotten the coins. So anxious were they to leave the room. But the dark hadn't finished with them yet. Slowly, the elongated tendrils of fingers spread out, fanning the robbers like a net, brushing past their skin in tender loving sweeps, so that they gasped and hid out widely into the blackness, as though expecting a bear or tiger to be behind them. And the dark smiled. They were near Ryan's bed now, and he could see the wall shimmering beneath the dead breath of the dark. He could see the long spidery fingers slip between the wall and into the laboratory beyond like a thin wavering key. He could see the equally long gloved hand slide itself out in answer, glistening with some sticky mucus and holding a pair of hot, sharp pincers at the end of the cruel, rubbery fingers. The robber nearest the door had no time even to scream. Click, clack, snip, snap. The pincers gripped him, kissed him, squeezed him again and again around his neck until his eyes nearly burst from their sockets. And then he was gone. The door closed behind him, and closed finally, but not before Ryan heard the last evil chuckle and the sudden rising wail of a cry that he hoped would never come again. Sean merely turned his back on them with another great snore. There was one left, and that one now gripped Ryan even more tightly as he inched him out of the doorway toward the stairs.
You're gonna get me out of here,
he told Ryan, his breath hot and sticky in the boy's ear.
and anything else that comes for me will be getting you first. You hear? It's getting you, not me. Understand? Now get me out of here!
Ryan nodded slowly. The dark was staring at him over the robber's shoulder, its empty eyes dark and expectant. Ryan could see it licking its lips.
But don't you want to see the cellar?
He asked, then his voice all innocence.
I want out of here!
The robber repeated, squeezed Ryan's neck a little tighter.
Okay,
answered Ryan.
but that's the jackpot. We're having a new leisure room built and all this stuff is stored down there. New TV, video games, you name it. Don't you at least want to take something for your trouble?
He felt strangely satisfied to sense the young man hesitate, the lure of greed rising in him like the rush of saliva before a good meal, the temptation too great to resist.
Okay.
The voice was final, thick and heavy.
Okay, but you're helping me get this stuff out. Quietly. I've a van parked down the road. You're sure there's nothing else down there? My mother told me so herself,
Ryan answered, spitting on his finger and crossing his heart carefully. It was one truth and the dark knew it. Ryan could see it wriggling in anticipation, like a cat before a mouse hole.
Right then,
the robber said, increasing the pressure on Ryan's neck just a little more.
Lead me down, but anything else happens, and you're first. Understand? Yes.
Ryan nodded uncomfortably, and the dark nodded with him, like a mirror. It seemed the longest journey he had ever known, shuffling step by step down the stairs, the robber anxious and clutching behind him for some unseen terror, as the dark merrily led the way, tooting a silent horn between its thin ropey fingers, as if marching them into battle. The cellar door was old and scary. It had great iron bands across it, many deep scratches mining its surface from the years of use. That's what his mother had told him. But Ryan knew better. He could hear the thing panting below, clenching inside and slavering as it waited for him. Slowly, he lowered his hand to the lock, hesitating briefly as he threw one last pleading look at the dark, and the dark smiled.
Hurry up!
The robber boy was beyond impatient now, his hands releasing Ryan as they thrust him out of the way, unclipping and unclasping and heaving the great slab of a door upwards in anticipation of revealing the buried treasure below. The door surfaced slowly, groaning with a creak that announced its resentment at being awoken at such a rude hour. There was a great rush of air, stale and hot and smelling of dead things, but the robber boy did not seem to notice. He stood at the top of the stairs, eagerly, circling his torch over the darkness below in wide, expectant sweeps. And then...
There's nothing here!
He turned to Ryan menacingly, the anger flashing from his eyes.
You little liar! Well, kid, after all this, I'm going to take something from this house away with me. Looks like that something is going to be you.
His hand shot out, dry and hard and clamped fast over Ryan's wrist. Ryan's eyes widened. Seemed he could no longer see the dark, could not see anything right at that moment, as he heard the shuffle of something large in the darkness below them. Crick, crack. He could hear the scrape of claws on the concrete. Then scrick, scrack. The bedding of the claws into the wood of the stairs as it clambered slowly up towards him, dragging itself, the stairs groaning anciently beneath its weight as it lumbered up towards its prey. There was a whiz of sound suddenly, like something shooting very fast, and the robber boy was gone. But not until he tightened his grip on Ryan's wrist. Ryan felt the strain, felt himself lifted in the air, felt the pain as intense as though his arm were being ripped off, and closed his eyes, ready to listen for the final crunch, ready for this moment as he had been his whole life. But all he heard was the gruesome cry of the creature as the dark swept in behind him, whisking him back like a gentle breeze, rescuing him, sheltering him, cradling him as it had done all Ryan's life. Ryan felt the searing pain of the claw down his arm as the door fell shut with a firm slam beneath him. The last thing he remembered was hearing the crush and grind of the robber boy's bones, the crunch and spit and tear of them, the grab and gobble and swallow of them as the moon monster lovingly devoured them into dust. There was no point in telling anyone, for they wouldn't have believed it. His mother had found him outside the closed cellar door, collapsed and bleeding, and after binding up his arm and merely scolding him for playing in the cellar when he should have been tucked in bed, Sean had accused him of trying to steal his coin back and had whacked him over the head with it when his mother wasn't looking. But Ryan knew better. He wouldn't bear the scar for the rest of his days. But he also knew he would never see the moon monster or any of the others ever again. And he knew he would never be frightened of the dark again, despite the new monsters his old friend might bring. His mother had told him that next year he was to have his own room, and he could not help but wonder what awaited in the unknown shadows that were to come. For the dark would always be there, as it always had been. Forever is a long time, and the dark is much longer than that, for it was there in the beginning before all things, just as it will still be there long after the end. The dark knows all the tricks there are to know, and all the stories too, and it smiled to itself at Ryan's musing, in its great age and wisdom, for it knew, too, what was to come. Ryan could see it now, grinning at him, and waiting, the spidery tendrils of its fingers and hair wrapping the night like a web, quivering as if anticipant, wetting its lips excitedly. And Ryan smiled back, for he knew the dark, and he would hide from it no more.